Order. Order. Lee Anderson to move the motion.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh. It is indeed a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I beg to move that this House considers antisocial behaviour in social housing. Now, imagine having a government that believes that a council house should be a privilege, not a right, that you have to be of good standing and be in full-time employment to secure the keys of a council house. Imagine a government that supports the idea that a council house should be given on suitability rather than need for social housing. And then imagine that same government supporting the idea that you should keep your council house in good order. You should keep it decorated, well maintained, do the gardens, empty your bins, make sure that your families aren't causing trouble on the street. There was such a government that believed in all that, and that was the 1940s Clement Attlee government. Clement Attlee built over 1 million homes in our great country. And all the things I've just discussed above were beliefs of the Labour government at the time. But fast forward 80 years, and I think Captain Clem would turn in his grave looking at some of the council estates up and down the country at the moment. Council estates like Corsic Estate, Leamington Estate, Coxmore Estate in Ashfield, Bull Farm, estates over in Mansfield, Ladybrook, where we have these families that are creating mayhem and misery. They call them feral families in my neck of the woods. These are people that are just causing problems on every single council estate throughout Mansfield, throughout Ashfield, and it's a big problem. And in this place, we have the power to sort this out. Now, I did try under the last government, but that sort of fell on deaf ears. Now, before I came to this place, one of the main complaints I got, and I'm sure many honourable members will agree with me, is antisocial behaviour on council estates in their constituencies. And this destroys and ruins lives. Now, most of us MPs in here, I would imagine, live in nice houses. We've got security, we've got CCTV, we've got panic alarms. Some of us live in nice big posh pads in gated communities. It's all right for us. We don't have to go home each night and put up with this horrible nuisance criminal behaviour. Now imagine coming home after a hard day's work at the factory, like many people in Ashfield do, and all you can hear is swearing, verbal threats, intimidation, shouting, screaming, outrageous noises. Sounds a bit like a Labour cabinet meeting, don't it, once a week? Joking aside, this is happening in every constituency throughout our great country. And then, when you put up this behaviour, when you've got home from a hard day's graft, you go to bed, and the noise continues. You can hear the music playing. You can hear the idiots from across the street on the motorbikes revving up and down the street. You open your bedroom window in the summer, there's a stench of weed comes wafting in. And then you manage to get a few hours sleep. 6 o'clock, your alarm clock goes off, and these idiots are just about going to bed at this time because they've been up all night creating mayhem, causing crime, and being complete nuisances. Yet when you get up at 6 o'clock in the morning to go to work, to do a shift, to do your 7 days, to pay your taxes, you're paying for these jobs, these idiots, to live in their social housing. You're paying for their rent, you're paying for their benefits, etc. And it makes people wonder why. Why are we doing this? Why can't these people live by our rules? Why can't they integrate? Why can't they live our way of life? Now, Ashfield District Council, many, many years ago, had this brainwave. I'm going back about 30 years. And we had one particular street on the Corsic Council Estate which was notorious for antisocial behaviour, notorious for crime, for poor behaviour. And they put all the nuisance tenants on one street. Now, I'm not saying this is a solution, but this is what they did. So when anything kicked off or any crime, the police went straight to one street, and they knew 9 times out of 10 that's where the culprits were. But the council, the Labour Council, had this brainwave. They decided to take every single nuisance family off this street and spread them around the estate and put them on different streets. They thought this was a good idea. They thought that the good behaviour of the surrounding streets would encourage these nuisance tenants to be good tenants, to be good neighbours, to integrate, to respect their neighbours. But the opposite happened. just a few months after, we realised that every single street on that estate was having problems with antisocial behaviour. So they took the problem from one street and spread it to every single street on that estate. It was a complete failure. And our police and councils can do very little about it because they're not backed up by the courts. When we get a nuisance tenant in, for example, in Ashfield, they sometimes do carry out a lengthy investigation. You know, they give the tenant the old diary sheets, keep a diary. They keep giving these diary sheets for about 2 years till the complainant is fed up to the back teeth of filling these out, and eventually they just get fed up and stop complaining. Now, in 2022, a government survey showed that 26% of social housing tenants suffered from antisocial behaviour. That's nearly 1 in 3 social housing tenants suffer from antisocial behaviour. It's a disgrace in this country. Another report in 2018 from Nottingham University said that social housing tenants were 30% more likely to see antisocial behaviour, crime, drug dealing, etc. Gladly give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way and congratulate him on securing the debate. On the issue that he's talking about, which is exceptionally important in working class areas, would he agree with me that those who suffer most from the problem are those who live cheek by jowl with the very tenants he's talking about? The aspiring working class tenancies in social housing that want to aspire to better life for them and their children, and they suffer most, and they are the people that are crying out for help and assistance to try and resolve the problem.
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. I couldn't put it any better myself. Absolutely right. As aspiring, decent, hard-working, working-class families, you know, they need that little bit of a leg up. They get that social housing, that council house. They want to do the right thing. Maybe at one stage actually buy that house. You know, they're putting a shift in. Mum and dad's going to work. Kids are behaving themselves. And what have they got next door across the road? A nuisance family who's completely ruining their lives, and it affects their mental health. And it is absolutely shocking.
Will he give way for that point in Wales?
Who's this? David.
Is defined as crime
David
and antisocial. Thank you. I'd like to thank him as well for securing this debate, which has got particular relevance in my own constituency, Brecon, Radnor and Cwmtawi. Rural crime is defined as crime and antisocial behaviour occurring wherever it happens, and that happens in rural areas too. We have plenty of social housing, but in my region, just 0.24% of staff in the local police force are dedicated to rural crime units, despite the significant impact that this has in places like Brecon and Uster-Gunlais. So does the honourable member agree with me that antisocial behaviour is a significant issue across Mid and South Wales as well, and that police resourcing should reflect that challenge?
Lee Anderson.
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with what he says. I'm not sure we can blame all that crime on council tenants or social housing tenants, but I do take your point. Now, I'm surprised I've not had an intervention yet from the government benches on, you know, the usual question I get asked is, where are these nuisance neighbours going to live? Where do we put them? Well, on the record, honourable members, I'm not bothered where they go. But I've got 2 solutions. I've got 2 options for these people. Now, they can either behave themselves and become good tenants, good neighbours, integrate, or they can do what other people do, normal people. Go and get a job, stop committing crime, save some money up, work hard, save a deposit, save enough for a bond, and then go on private rent somewhere. The important thing here is we need a deterrent. And I can go back to a situation I had when I was a councillor in Ashfield, where we had youths on the local park who were creating mayhem, they were making fires, they were attacking people, they were doing all sorts of horrible, feral behaviour on the local park. And we had a real problem with the council and the police, and me as their local councillor, trying to sort this problem out. But after a bit of an investigation, we found that a lot of these young youths who were causing the problems, their parents lived in social housing on the nearby estate. So we went to see and wrote to every single parent of these children and said to them, if your child carries this on, you're breaching your tenancy agreement, and we might have to look at booting you out. You know what? It stopped straight away. The poor behaviour stopped overnight. So this is one option we have. I hope the ministers, you know, can look at this at some stage in the future at tenancies of social housing tenants with this sort of poor behaviour. Now, I believe in a 3 strikes and out sort of rule, where you give them a warning, then another warning, and then on the 3rd warning, you're gone. And quite frankly, like I said before, I'm not that interested where these people go and live, because my focus, my concern really, is the decent, hard-working people who do put a shift in, who haven't got much money, that rely on social housing to keep them. And I do agree with the Clement Attlee government of the 1940s that a council house should be based on suitability rather than need. But to do that, we need to go back and repeal some laws we passed here 40-odd years ago in housing and homelessness legislation, and look at the people who are in priority need. And I think you know, it should be suitability, and the people that should be priority need are the people that's going to respect the house, going to be good citizens, going to go to work, and not be a nuisance in their neighbourhood. And that's me done. Thank you.
I remind members that should they wish to speak and be called in this debate, they do need to bob. And I will also remind members that if you do wish to speak, you need to be here at the opening and closing statements. Wind-ups will begin at 10:30, and then obviously there's 2 minutes at the end for the proposer of the motion. So, are people bobbing? Steve, yeah.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I do wish to thank the Honourable Member for Ashfield for securing this important debate. The Labour Government has a very clear mission to tackle antisocial behaviour and halve violence against women and girls. And my constituency in Mansfield is particularly troubled by endemic antisocial behaviour, both domestically and in our town centre. As well as this, Mansfield is the worst affected town in Nottinghamshire in relation to violent offences perpetrated by men against women. And colleagues will note my concern for women's welfare in both of these regards, as I've alluded to in previous debates. So my experience from listening to victims of antisocial behaviour in this context, they're often women who are being systematically failed by a response system that's really not fit for purpose, and therefore disadvantages women victims in their journey for justice that they face with this abuse. So this is not a criticism of the police at all, or necessarily even community safety and housing teams and officers within local authorities. But broadly speaking, my experience is that they're doing their utmost to deal with the situation that they face within the legal framework that they face and the resources that they have. But before I continue, I'd also like to pass my gratitude on to Nottinghamshire Police, especially Inspector Davies and her neighbourhood team in Mansfield, as well as my local authority, Mansfield District Council, for engaging in particular with my office about the casework that I've received in the course of dealing with some of the issues that have already been outlined by the Honourable Member for Ashfield. And I can already see the impact that the new neighbourhood policing approach and strategy is having in Mansfield. Yes, I will, yes.
Lee Anderson.
The Honourable Member for giving way. He makes some great points, actually. But does he agree with me that if we can get this right and stop this nuisance behaviour, this horrible behaviour in our social housing, then there would be hardly any need for our police to come and save police resources?
Steve, yeah.
Well, indeed, and I thank the Honourable Member for Ashfield for his intervention, and I do agree, and I'll address that in further comments that I'll make as well. So I think it is, by me, having named neighbourhood officers taking ownership of their patches in council estates, in social housing areas, in our town, and becoming part of the community again, I think we're already beginning to see in multi-agency meetings the impact that that can have. Now, in the press over the weekend, the Honourable Member for Ashfield has mentioned his desire to implement a 3-strike rule for social housing tenants, and he has talked about it again today, that would see them evicted after 3 instances of antisocial behaviour. That meets the evidence threshold that would demonstrate that instance. Now, I would argue that this proposition is somewhat too liberal and lenient and doesn't go far enough to address the issues. Yes, I will, indeed.
Lee Anderson.
I'm actually astounded that, that the Honourable Member for Mansfield disagrees on this point, but will he now agree to a one-strike and out rule?
Well,
Steve Yem.
I think that's exactly what I'm saying to the Honourable Member, that actually if I see and wish to address the issues that are being endured by social housing tenants at the hands of those who are consistently perpetrating domestic antisocial behaviour in their neighbourhoods, that a 3 strikes and you're out approach would take many, many years of them suffering under this type of abuse. And I can outline, Madam Chairman, why I think such an approach would be lacking in its effectiveness of outcome and deterrence. So firstly, my experience is that the evidence threshold in this instance, so councils in my area, and I think in many other areas, are asking those victims of antisocial behaviour in social housing to prove the burden of evidence by taking their own recordings and notebooks and submitting them. Many constituents who attend my surgeries have gone through all of that stress and anxiety of doing this on numerous occasions. They have put their mental well-being and personal security often at risk, to only then be told that the measures in place don't meet the threshold required to instigate an intervention on this basis. Yes, I'll give way, yes.
And I agree very much with his points. And I wonder if he's a member of the right party on that basis, actually. But is he not dismayed, therefore, that the Secretary of State has ditched our plans to remove social housing for people who are consistently guilty of antisocial behaviour?
Steve Yem.
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Member for his intervention. And, you know, my dismay is what I hear from my constituents, many of whom have suffered for many years trying to prove a single instance of antisocial behaviour. And indeed, often they're further notified that the advised method of evidence collection, often recordings on a mobile phone app, then does not satisfy the evidential requirements to take action. And after many years of threats to their own security, of great deal of effort, they find that the action is then dropped and then has to be started again. And this is not an isolated incident in my constituency. Many, many women, and it's almost always women, have come to me in tears at my surgeries. Yes, I do.
Lee Anderson.
Yes. Very generous with his time today. He does mention women quite a lot in his speech, but let's talk about pensioners. Does he agree with me? Because we have this nonsense in Ashfield again, where we have these units, these flats, these bungalows, which were designed for pensioners over 65s. Now, sadly, as some of these pensioners die off, another brainwave from the local council, they've started putting nuisances in these flats, druggies, ex-cons, people that live a life of criminality. And you put one of these people in, and all their friends and family come to visit, and it's creating problems in flats that were designed just for the over 65s. Do you think we should have a policy where we need to where we stop this straight away and let these old people live in peace?
Steve Yem.
Well, again, I'll thank the Honourable Member for his intervention, and the experience that I have from casework tells me many of those things also. But of course, what I do see are many examples of such casework at my surgery, and I think councils should be and must be better equipped for enforcement action than they are today. I think they need dedicated response. It needs to be backed by stronger regulation. They need to work more closely alongside the police to gather evidence of reports of antisocial behaviour. But in turn, I would hope that this would free up our police officers to respond to more serious criminal activity rather than having to focus their resources on these recurring incidences. And secondly, it's my outlook that affording up to 3 strikes under the current system may well perpetuate the crisis, further leaving some of those upstanding and decent social housing tenants at the mercy of problem tenants in neighbourhoods in my constituency. I fear that this would mean that tenants in those neighbouring properties that could be subject to a process that could take years to conclude, or that failed to do so because of loopholes and inconsistency in their self-collected evidence. So I think, we do have a new Labour government. We're looking to renew the social contract between the state and individuals, but part of that contract does require those certain commitments of responsibility to earn the rights it provides. I think social housing tenants should be expected, as with all citizens and other citizens, to respect their neighbours and not contribute to antisocial behaviour, or they'll forfeit the right to be housed by their council. So, in my outlook, rather than 3 strikes, this should be a zero-tolerance policy, and I'm confident that my constituents that suffer at the hands of antisocial behaviour in their neighbourhoods would agree with me. And finally, Madam Chairman, I want to outline the mechanism that I've collaborated in with Mansfield Police and Mansfield District Council to tackle this. It has in some part been made possible by the government's neighbourhood policing strategy and the direction of Nottinghamshire Police under the Labour Police and Crime Commissioner Gary Godden. Antisocial behaviour is often complex in its nature and often requires a multifaceted, multi-agency approach to resolve it, which should, in my limited experience, prevent the passing of the buck. However, this collaboration can only be effective as the legislative support it has to operate under, and we've seen the effect that government policy is already having on neighbourhood policing. And stronger powers for councils would enable them to provide the peace and security of respecting and respectable social housing tenants that abide by their tenancy contracts and reflect our British values of decency towards their neighbours.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A real pleasure to speak and a real pleasure to serve under your chairship as well, as always. Thank you so much for that opportunity. The Honourable Member for Ashfield for leading the debate and setting the scene on an issue. Look, there's not one of us in this chamber today that hasn't been impacted through our constituents on this issue. And I want to give a couple of examples. I have to say that perhaps maybe one of the examples I will give will be incredibly extreme. But it does, I think, illustrate the issue of what we do. I know the Minister has no responsibility for housing in Northern Ireland, but I know he's a deep interest in Northern Ireland, and he's attended the court in Northern Ireland on a number of occasions, and we're always very, very pleased to see him there, because we know he does that out of interest and wanted to help as well. Issues surrounding antisocial behaviour are something that impacts all of our constituencies, and we are no strangers to dealing with these issues in our offices. Indeed, I have to say that, unfortunately, probably nearly every week I have at least 1 or 2 of these things. And they're not always, by the way, social housing, Madam Chair. Sometimes they're private housing as well. So don't ever think it's just those who live in social housing are where the problems are. There is more to be done to protect tenants, and also gives housing associations more rights to take control of their own properties. So with that in mind, it's great to be here to discuss that. Can I first of all commend the intervention of my right honourable friend, the member for East London Derry, who made a very, very pertinent comment. Many of those people in social housing aspire to own their own house, whether it be the house that they're living in under the system of purchase, or want to aspire to moving elsewhere. And I remember many, many years ago, to give this story as an example, someone come to say, Jim, I've been offered a house up in a certain place, and he says, I'm not sure where I should take it now because it's got a reputation. I says, well, my suggestion to you, it's a lovely house, it's a lovely area, I think you should take it. And the reason why I say that, you could go there And you might think you could have the best neighbour you ever had in your life, and you go to somewhere really special, and you could have the neighbour from hell. That's how it works. You have no control over who your neighbour is. So the area that you live in does not always mean that it may be a bad area. I give that just as an example. That person went to that house, by the way, took that house, and they're still living there. So there's an example of taking that opportunity and having neighbours who are really genuine and lovely. I have a great working relationship with the housing executive in my constituency, both for Ards and North Down Council, and also for Newry, Mourne and Down, because that takes in a large portion of my constituency and the boundary changes. I believe it's important to have a good working relationship with the housing associations, the Housing Executive number 1, which is the biggest house owner in Northern Ireland, but also with Choice Housing, Radius Housing, Clanmill Housing, Alpha Housing and Habitat. I name all of those because those are all important housing associations, providers in my constituency. And I believe, Madam Chair, that working together we are able to ensure that tenants are safe and that their issues are dealt with quickly and efficiently. So I mentioned earlier on, I'm sorry, I don't agree with the 3 strikes and you're out. To be honest with you, if you're continuing to party with addiction issues, with noise, with disturbance, with damage, all those around you, especially in flats. If you're in a 6-block flat, just an example, and one of them is partying all the time, see the other 5, they're all impacted by it, and maybe the neighbours next door as well. So you can't ignore what's happening. And I think and when you sign for a house as a tenant, you have a list of conditions and rules that you're supposed to adhere to. Now, if you can't adhere to those rules, then you're out. That's another gentleman referred to that there, and I actually think that's right. It's only right that those who want to have a decent life and aspire to other things and a quality of life, and even if they don't aspire to own a house, aspire to live where they are in a peaceful means with their neighbours. Those are the priorities that we should be trying to achieve. So the honourable gentleman, by bringing this debate today, has done us a justice on an issue that many of us have a every day, every week contact with. Antisocial behaviour encompasses numerous disruptive activities, excessive noise, vandalism, the harassment and other actions that cause harm or distress to individuals or the community. Another one which is prevalent, specifically in my constituency, seems to be drinking and drugs. I'm sorry to say it. I mean, I know people have addictions. I'm not here to criticise anybody, but I'm just gently say those with addictions, whether it be alcohol, whether it be drugs, whatever there may be, they have a responsibility to look after and not cause a problem to their neighbours. Both the Northern Ireland Housing Executive and the house associations offer clear guidelines on what constitutes antisocial behaviour and provide mechanisms for residents to report incidents. Yeah, absolutely.
Carla Lockhart.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and can I commend the member for this excellent debate today. Would my honourable friend agree with me that we have so many good, hard-working families, predominantly in our working class estates, that are being absolutely tortured because of inappropriate placing of people within their estates? Often we see people who have such addictions placed beside elderly residents and folks. So there needs to be appropriate placing by our housing authorities, and also when a problem is identified, then there needs to be action taken against them. It can't run on for 3, 4, 5 years just to get these people into court.
Jim Shannon.
My honourable friend and colleague for that intervention. And I'm minded of again, I'm rather loath for Hansard, Madam Chair, to name certain things, so I'm going to keep them out of it, but I'm going to give the examples without naming the estates. We had occasion, the very thing that the Honourable Lady refers to, by the way, where they seem to move these single people, individuals with problems. And why were they moved out of the other states in Belfast and Newton Abbey and further afield to come to Newton Ards? I'll tell you why. Because they caused bother in those estates and they had to move them elsewhere. And they thought that this estate in my town, in Newton Ards, was going to be the destination. They brought their problems with them. And we had to have a meeting with the police, with the housing executive, with an intermediary body who tries to work and find solutions as well, and with the Tenants Association and with local representatives. It's a massive problem. Those people who cause problems, well, Honourable Gentleman has referred as an example, a street where they were all put together. I think that there's a responsibility for the tenants to realise what they do, and they must adhere to the rules. The Northern Ireland Housing Centre emphasises early intervention and prevention strategies to address antisocial behaviours effectively. The PSNI, and it's important that you have the police working alongside with you, are also instrumental in providing support in relation to keeping peace, because on many occasions it becomes to blows and fighting, and it spills out onto the street, and sometimes worse things happen. But the police's first objective is to keep the peace and to ensure that there's as little disruption as possible. Just to give a perspective of this issue in Northern Ireland, in the 12-month period from March 23 to February 24, just not that far back, there were, my goodness, 45,355 antisocial behaviour incidents recorded by the PSNI in Northern Ireland with a population of 1.9 million. My goodness, that should give us an idea of the mathematics of the stats of the issue, which does in theory represent a decrease compared to, but still an enormous figure nonetheless. Madam Chair, many may be aware, and I give this example, it's an extreme example, but again, they built, one of the housing associations built a house in Newton Ards, a estate in Newton Ards. We expressed at the very beginning some concern over potentially that these estates have become aligned to one paramilitary group. I expressed that. I met the housing association at the very beginning to ensure that wouldn't happen. They told they were constrained by the point system to allocating properties. But it was Weaver's Grange in Newton Ards. I'll put on record this one because it became a very provincial story on a weekly basis and over a period of time, where one organisation tried to ensure that the only people who could live in that estate were those who belonged to a certain group, and everyone else who wanted to go there found it impossible to stay there. Now, several homes were targeted, windows smashed, graffiti sprayed. They were considered to be part of local ongoing disputes. It has taken almost the last 3 years to erase that potential that there was, and for people, the houses are lovely, by the way. The houses are really, really gorgeous houses, and you'd love to have one of them and live in it, because they're very modern and very sought after. But if you can't be getting peace in those estates, then you have a really serious problem to address. Now, housing associations come round at the end of the day understood the issues, and with the help of the housing association, the local community groups, because they're really critically important to trying to find solutions. I think, I know that one gentleman referred to as well, you're absolutely right. Local community groups are critical to finding the solutions to make places acceptable. Some of those intimidations were actually death threats as well, so they were pretty heavy stuff. But efforts have been taken by local policing neighbourhood teams, that's the community policing officers, the community groups, the housing associations, elected representatives, both myself, MLAs, councillors and community councillors as well. This is another clear example, I believe, of the impact that antisocial behaviour can have on social housing developments, and in particular the impact it can have on other tenants in the area. The issue that I would suggest, and it's my question to the Minister, will be the one where, when it comes to evicting a tenant, you have to go to court, it takes such a long time. I wonder, is there anything legislatively, Madam Chair, that perhaps the Minister in his responsibility always is very, very helpful in his responses, could do to have a system that makes it quicker, that takes the niggle out of the aggravation out of the whole thing at an earlier stage. And I will commit, and within my constituency, I will commit to working alongside partners to help combat instances of antisocial behaviour. I've in the past met with members from the local policing teams to discuss strategies for combating ASB in local areas, and I give examples: Newton Ards, Killyleigh, Portavogie. I'm sorry, I'm realising I'm going a wee bit on the last paragraph now. To conclude, Madam Chair, there is more work to be done to tackle antisocial behaviour incidents in social housing areas, and the key word here is collaboration. So really important to have that collaboration in all those bodies, in conjunction with local police, housing associations, members, other community politicians. There are so many other avenues we can utilise to put an end to instances of ASB. So it is essential we do this to make our towns and communities safer, happier, and a better place to live and work. And I look to the ministers, I always do, in a positive way for his response, for his commitment to ensure more is done across the whole of the United Kingdom to do so. And I know that the minister will be in touch with the representatives and the bodies back home as well, and perhaps maybe he could give us some assurance in that. Madam Chair, thank you.
Andrew Cooper.
And it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Ms McVeigh. Antisocial behaviour affects the very fabric of our neighbourhoods. This problem not only impacts the lives and well-being of those directly involved, but also reverberates throughout our communities, creating an environment of fear, discomfort and division. Ultimately, it serves to undermine the sense of community and safety that we all strive to preserve. The title of this debate is Social Housing, Tenants and Antisocial Behaviour, and that's clearly what the Honourable Member for Ashfield wishes to focus on. But I do think it's important to place this in context. The ASB occurs in all types of housing and in many other settings. As a councillor, some of the most serious ASB I dealt with related to neighbour disputes in owner-occupied housing, in private rented housing, and problems in our town centre, none of which were caused by social housing tenants. And not a day goes by when my casework mailbag doesn't highlight another example of a family desperately needing more appropriate, affordable housing that we need to get on and build, and well-designed, well-managed social housing has an important role to play in that. All that said, social housing providers are in a unique position in that they're well placed to tackle ASB when it does occur in this context, and they can influence factors such as estate design and tenant support to try and prevent it from occurring in the first place. In my own area, as you'll be aware of, Chair, I've witnessed firsthand the problems posed by poorly designed and badly planned Section 106 affordable housing. Schemes where properties have been designed without proper outdoor spaces, schemes where properties have been clustered together for the convenience of the house builder rather than prioritising good estate management. And with the explosion in homelessness that has occurred over the last 14 years, combined with the systematic dismantling of local government, support services for dealing with addiction issues have been overstretched. So in some cases, this clustering of vulnerable individuals without effective support in place has led to significant antisocial behaviour that directly affects the neighbouring homeowners and the broader community. But on top of that, it also diminishes the potential for recovery and stability for the people themselves, and this is just not a sustainable situation. To effectively tackle these problems, we must advocate for a holistic approach to support. It's crucial that social housing providers and councils work together to provide tenants grappling with addiction not only the necessary resources to address their challenges, but also with comprehensive wraparound support systems to help them maintain their tenancies and transform their lives. We cannot simply place individuals in homes without equipping them with the tools they need to thrive, and the funding the government announced just before Christmas for homelessness prevention is the first step to tackling this problem. I also believe that changes are needed to the planning system to deal with this issue. Section 106 affordable homes are vital in tackling the housing crisis we face, but it's just not good enough to only include social housing providers in the design at the last minute. It's vital that these homes are thoughtfully integrated throughout new housing development rather than clustered together in one corner. This strategic pepper potting, I'd be happy to give way, yeah.
Lee Anderson.
This is more like it. I thank him for giving way. He talks about new house builds and integrating social housing into the new house building estates. Now, this is a big problem for me in Ashfield. We have all these new housing estates, and they sort of give, I think it's about 10% for social housing. Now, most of the time, the tenants that move into these social houses on the private estate are good tenants, but then we get one or two or maybe three, again, nuisance families who go on and create mayhem for the rest of the people. Bear in mind, these people have bought their houses, their mortgage, they're working 7 days a week to pay for these houses, and next door, in exactly the same built house, is a family that doesn't go to work, they're smoking weed, they're causing problems, and making their life a misery. And I've had several cases where these people have actually bought their house, have had to move out because the social housing provider has not acted on this. So, does he agree with me that when we build these social houses on new housing estates, all the lets should be sensitive lets, and it should be based on suitability rather than need?
Andrew Cooper.
Thank you. Well, I thank you for your intervention. I think where I would agree is that the house builder might well release a lot of Section 106 properties all at the same time. And the effect of that could be that where people are at the top of the waiting list, Band A perhaps, that a lot of those are placed simultaneously. And I think that where you do that without the support mechanism in place, without having dealt with the addiction issues in the first place, without having looked at the issues that might be caused, and that's where you can have problems. So I think it's not so simple. It's not so simple as perhaps he makes out. Well, I disagree. I think that it's important to look at it holistically and consider the wider support system that you need to put in place when you're placing people in social housing in the first instance. So, finally, we can't overlook the importance of visible neighbourhood policing, something that I believe was disregarded and diminished under the previous government. A strong police presence in our communities can serve as both a deterrent to antisocial behaviour and a reassurance to residents. It fosters trust and collaboration between law enforcement and the community, creating a safer environment for everyone. And that's why I welcome the government's commitment to provide 13,000 additional neighbourhood police officers and community PCSOs, and I hope the Minister can provide an update on the provision of these officers across the country and in Cheshire Constabulary in my own police force area. I believe we must advocate for stronger strategic partnerships between local authorities, housing providers and law enforcement agencies to ensure our communities are resilient against the threats of antisocial behaviour. Again, I hope the Minister can outline the importance of a multi-agency approach to tackling these problems and say what steps are being taken to promote such collaborative working. It's clear that addressing antisocial behaviour requires a multifaceted approach, and I believe that by providing holistic support to vulnerable tenants, advocating for better planning policies and enhancing neighbourhood policing, we can create safer, more harmonious communities for all.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the excellent honourable member for Ashfield in securing this debate. He's been most generous in some of his suggestions, almost unusually so, which I shall come to shortly. It seems to me we have to have the courage to look internationally at what works elsewhere. We look to New York City in the early 1990s. They had a simple slogan, broken windows. It starts right at the ground level. And they transformed what was a lawless city by saying we want no broken windows, we want no graffiti, and we want no antisocial behaviour. And it worked. And they flooded the streets with a visible security presence. And we actually know that having a proper deterrent also works. And my honourable friend was more than generous, unusually so, with his traffic light system of 3 strikes and out. I actually prefer a sort of Premier League football style scenario. You get a yellow card, and then you get a red card. And I think the consequence, the knowledge that you're going to lose your home as a family if your youngsters misbehave, if they rev their cars, if they smoke drugs, if they play their music from morning to night and dusk and throughout the night. And these are the experiences, Madam Chair, that I hear from my constituents in Boston and Skegness and between. And it is so unfair because whether you're a pensioner or whether you're going out to work, to pay your taxes, to pay your mortgage, to pay your rent, those who live next door or nearby, who are not going to work and who are causing absolute mayhem, it is unacceptable. And I think we have to have the courage to say that with rights come responsibilities. With the right to have a home, a social housing home, a council home, comes the responsibility to look after it both inside, but also to be part of the community on the street, in the housing estate, and beyond. In the same way that with the right to receive a benefit, if you're sick or if you're looking for work, actually comes the responsibility to contribute to society by looking for work. And we have to instill that within our culture. I think a deterrent is really important. So if you don't behave, actually 2 strikes and you're out. You lose your home. In the same way that if you don't look for work, you lose your benefits. If you misbehave, you lose your benefits. All of a sudden, if people understand that, then maybe things will change. I don't think we need more legislation. I think the legislation already exists here because, for example, public space protection orders can be used much more widely than they currently are. And I think councils need to be much braver, using them not just in town centres, but also in residential estates. And actually, police forces are massively stretched. In my county of Lincolnshire, the police force has the worst funding formula in the whole country, and that's the subject of a review, and that's got to change. But there are other things one can do. For example, housing associations could use PSPOs, and they could use private prosecutions. And I've seen that recently, and we know that it can work. Private prosecutions, rapidly used, always used by housing associations on nuisance tenants, will send a message. Unacceptable behaviour has consequences. You will be fined. You will be prosecuted. You will lose your home. So I think that what is required is not more resources, but it's a proper focus to use the existing legislative and framework and other aspects that are available. And if we do that properly, Madam Chair, then I think we can make a significant difference. But it's a cultural thing. We have to make it clear to everybody that this selfish, horrific behaviour is unacceptable. It's unacceptable to communities, it's unacceptable to decent, hard-working families, and frankly, it's unacceptable to this country. Thank you, Madam Chair.
We move now to the front bench, and we'll start with the opposition spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats, Gideon Amos.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship today, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Ashfield for securing this important debate. Liberal Democrats believe everyone deserves to feel safe in their own homes, walking down their own streets, but for too many that isn't something they can rely upon. Antisocial behaviour can have a devastating impact on individuals, on families, on neighbourhoods, causing distress both tenants and landlords. Police force freedom of information requests obtained by the Liberal Democrats last April found that under the last government, average police response times to antisocial behaviour incidents increased by 37% since 2021. Some forces taking an average of 17.5 hours to attend if they attended the scene at all. In some ways, that's unsurprising, given that under the last government, 4,500 PCSOs were taken off our streets since 2015. In my own Taunton and Wellington constituency, the outgoing Conservative Police and Crime Commissioner only last April reduced PCSOs by a further 80 in Avon and Somerset, where only 19% of reported antisocial behaviour incidents are attended by the police. And I'm urging the Chief Constable to put more officers on the beat in Taunton Town Centre right now to tackle antisocial behaviour in that environment. Years of ineffective resourcing under previous Conservative governments, particularly since 2015, have left police forces overstretched, ending the kind of community policing that's so valuable in tackling antisocial behaviour, Ms McVeigh. Liberal Democrats stand for bringing back proper community policing, a tough, evidence-based and therefore effective approach to eradicate antisocial behaviour for the benefit of all decent law-abiding residents and communities. Antisocial behaviour can include, of course, a range of nuisance and criminal behaviours which are causing distress. Examples: noisy, abusive behaviour, vandalism, intimidation, drunkenness, littering, fly tipping, drug use, excessively barking dogs. And whether someone's actions can be classed as antisocial behaviour relies heavily on the impact it has on other people. So antisocial behaviour is a complex problem. It has many root causes, which means they all need to be tackled together to effectively address it. Landlords rightly have important powers to remove tenants who are genuinely damaging property of the surrounding community, and I refer the House to my experience as a social housing landlord in the register of interest, Ms McVeigh. However, those powers cannot come at the price of putting all tenants at unjustified risk of eviction for no reason. That's why we've long campaigned for an end to no-fault evictions, and we welcome the government's legislation to bring that to reality in the Renters' Rights Bill. And we fought hard for a fair definition of antisocial behaviour during the Renters' Reform Bill under the previous government, and will continue to defend tenants against unfair evictions, which in itself can be a form of antisocial behaviour. Landlords, the police, local authorities therefore rightly consider all these factors when deciding how best to deal with reports of antisocial behaviour. Each report is looked at individually by considering the suffering of the victims and the impact on the wider community. But the outcome of just one such instance can lead to eviction from social housing, a form of one strike and you're out practice which is in place across the country. And that is something, that is a vital tool that landlords need and have, and that Liberal Democrats support. And I was pleased to hear the Honourable Member for Mansfield supporting a similar approach. Extending what we currently have as a one-strike approach to a three-strike would simply be a soundbite that would make the law weaker and give comfort and credence to the most antisocial culprits. The best deterrent would be to resource the powers and the police forces we already have and to make it work. Simply evicting people onto the streets won't reduce the incidence of ASB. It will move the antisocial behaviour from the house to the street, where all the evidence suggests it will only get worse. One of the causes of antisocial behaviour, studies such as by Stansfield and the British Journal of Criminality has found, is housing instability itself. And that's why social housing is critical, not just to provide homes for those who need them, but to create stable communities where people can thrive. Liberal Democrats are actively pushing for 150,000 new social homes per year to be built annually. This would not only reduce housing instability, also mean there are enough homes for those who need them. Indeed, I'd be happy.
James McMurdo.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you raising the point of stability, and I absolutely agree. And I think in the vast majority of cases with good people who are contributing to society and making the most of their situation, that stability goes a long way. But I think the point raised around a deterrent being necessary is also something that we have to consider, because we cannot have the good people of this world being held to ransom by the bad. There has to be consequences for the bad, even if we don't necessarily like them. That is how we work towards the best possible outcome for the most people. Do you agree with me on that point?
Gideon Amos.
The gentleman is absolutely right that we do need to have clear deterrent and effective deterrent. And if we don't have properly working police forces and community policing, we're not going to get that. And that's how we would fund that, something I'll come back to in my closing remarks. As I say, everyone deserves decent accommodation, providing that alongside a new generation of rent-to-own housing, so people have a stake in the houses they live in, so they're ultimately going to own them, as well as more key worker accommodation. As another honourable gentleman mentioned the experience in New York, where key worker accommodation, including police officers and other community professionals living in social housing areas, had a massive impact. But that depended on resources being put into the police and into public services on a big scale to make that work in New York, and that would be needed here in the UK as well. Together, those things can create the stable mixed communities which are the antidote to antisocial behaviour. Sadly, the sell-off of council housing over decades of different Conservative administrations has left too many estates only for those with the most problems, with fewer and fewer public services to support the families and communities that need them. Add to this divisive rhetoric, pitting one struggling family against another and in an argument about who deserves a home the most, and you have a race to the bottom for the community concerned. Instead, we should be increasing the pitiful level of social housing, injecting proper community policing, investing in public services, letting landlords use their legal powers strongly and appropriately, including through acceptable behaviour contracts, something pioneered right back in the 2000s and 2003 in Somerset and Islington and other council areas. Together, those measures will prove the most effective way to tackle antisocial behaviour. But above all, we need to bring back proper community policing after its total erosion over recent Conservative governments, and more bobbies on the beat. Our manifesto would fund and deliver that through investing in acceptable behaviour contracts, making youth diversion schemes a statutory duty so that every part of the country has a pre-charged diversion schemes for young people, freeing up existing officers' time by the creation of an online crime agency, drawing up a national recruitment and retention strategy to tackle the shortage of detectives, and abolishing police and crime commissioners, investing the savings in frontline policing instead, including tougher action on antisocial behaviour. Thank you.
Andrew Cooper.
In the last moment.
He's talked a lot in his speech about what we do about antisocial behaviour after we've already discovered that it's taking place, an awful lot of emphasis on what the police can do. But does he agree with me that it's better to deal with antisocial behaviour before it occurs? It's better to deal with underlying addiction issues. It's better for social housing providers to put resources into tenancy sustainability so that new tenants understand the behaviour that's expected of them before problems occur.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. He is absolutely right. And so many of the entrenched problems that occur in families and communities need support and public service involvement and investment in those public services. You take away systematically the policing, the social services support, the local authority support, the housing officers, as we've seen in the shrinking of local government over recent years, then it's hardly surprising we get an increase in social problems because we're not investing early on to deal with those problems. And thank you for thank you for allowing me to contribute to this important debate.
Kevin Hollenreich.
Thank you very much, Ms McVeigh. It's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair, and I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman, the member for Ashfield, for securing this very important debate. And because we have all of us, had experiences of very distressing constituency cases that are a real problem for our communities. And I agree with his description of that. It can cause mayhem and misery for our local communities. And I also agree with him that social housing should be a privilege, not a right. And also that those houses should be kept in good order. We have all experienced in our days canvassing our patch. You go to areas of social housing where you see the gardens overgrown, you see litter, and you see furniture out in the gardens, and this cannot be right for those people in those houses, in terms of the children, but also in terms of their neighbours. It's simply not right. And it's good to see, actually, across the House today, that we seem to be in violent agreement. The three strikes policy, which I'll talk about in a second, actually, that seems to be a maximum, not a minimum. I think we've heard some people argue for, or one person, the honourable member for Boston and Skegness, argue for a two-strikes policy, and indeed the honourable member for Mansfield arguing for a one-strike policy. And I think this is something I'm encouraged by, because I think it's fair to say everybody in this debate so far, and we're interested to see what the Minister will say, of course, everybody so far has said we need to do more. I'm very happy to give way.
Richard Tice.
You see, competition's a good thing. It may be that the Minister for the Government wants no strikes in your house.
Kevin Hollenreich.
That might be a bit tricky. I think people do deserve to live in a house as long as they do demonstrate good behaviour. But indeed, I've got to say, what was then my predecessor as Shadow Secretary of State, now the Leader of the Opposition, Kimmy Badenoch, said that those who break the law, make neighbours' lives a misery, or treat the UK as a hotel they're just passing through, should not be given subsidised housing. The public want to know that only decent and hard-working people that have contributed to this country are given social housing. I agree with that point. Contrast that then, I'm afraid to say, the Minister is a very decent chap, and I'm really interested to listen to what he's going to say. But the current Secretary of State, Deputy Prime Minister, confirmed Labour's plans to ditch proposals from the Conservative government to take away social housing from criminals, including those with a history of antisocial behaviour. Also been the Conservatives' commitment to prioritise social housing for those with local and British connections. I'm very disappointed by that approach, and we think we need to revisit that, and I very much hope he will, based on what's been said here earlier in this debate. This all despite the Prime Minister pledging a new clampdown on criminal and violent disorder. Can I also pick up on what the honourable member, my honourable friend from Strangford, said earlier in his remarks? And can I totally agree with him on the point many of the points he made, but also in terms of on right to buy. I grew up in a little town in North Yorkshire which had large council estates. Back in the 70s, I used to deliver milk there as a young man, and those council estates weren't in the best of order. And some of the behaviours and some of the conditions of those houses were not the best because people did not look after those houses. One of the benefits of right to buy, as well as giving individuals the benefit of right to buy, those individuals who bought those homes also improved those homes significantly. Double glazing, extensions, smart gardens, you see the quality of those estates increase dramatically. Therefore, it is a real concern that the government has decided to cut back, to water down, to make it more difficult for residents, for occupants, for the people renting those social houses to buy those homes. It cannot be right, particularly when the Deputy Prime Minister herself, it's her policy, has benefited from those very opportunities. That cannot be. It is rank hypocrisy. It cannot be right.
Gideon Amos.
Very happy to give way.
Would the honourable gentleman agree that if the government is going to provide for the selling off of council houses, it should have invested in the replacement of those council houses so that we shouldn't have had a massive loss of council housing in this country as we have had over the last few decades?
Well, as he knows, we have increased the number of affordable houses significantly over since 2010. I think there's over 500,000 new affordable homes. What I don't think he quite knows is there is a limit on how much money you have. So, the more social housing you provide, the more expensive that is going to be. So he sets out lots of plans which are very expensive. We're going to take the tax rates in this country completely through the roof. If that's what people want to vote for, then that's what they should vote for. That's not what I believe in. I believe there are finite resources and we've got to use those resources very carefully. Our plans did set out that we would give preference to local residents and to armed forces veterans, but also, crucially, we'd disqualify those with unspent antisocial behaviour convictions and those guilty of other offences. I don't quite agree with the honourable gentleman, the member for Ashfield, when he says that his calls, when a member of our party, or presumably, and from where he is currently, fell on deaf ears. There was much work done, I think, in government. You could argue not enough, but much work was done. Yes, of course I will.
Lee Anderson.
I thank him. He's very generous with his time, and you talk about my history of being in a different party. Maybe if I was still in the Conservative Party, I'd actually be sat there today on those empty chairs, showing that I actually care about this important issue.
Kevin Hollinrake.
Well, I know he would be, absolutely. And he always stood up for his constituents, and indeed mine. And every member in this House today, he stood up for those. And I always admired that he did, and he will continue to do so, I know. If you can track this back to 2014, the Antisocial Behaviour, Crime and Policing Act, where we did give more powers to social landlords and also powers to victims themselves. And we all obviously have met those victims at our surgeries and been to see the situations they live in. But now they can demand from the agencies to make sure their problems are dealt with more effectively by bringing those agencies together. And also for social landlords, giving social landlords more power to evict offenders, people who are guilty of this kind of abuse. Can I say, and also added resources to this in terms of £160 million. Just in terms of that, of course, legislation is nothing without implementation, and we need the right policing resources, as a number of members have referred to in the debate. I've got to pick up the Lib Dem spokesman, in terms of his point, the member for Taunton and Wellington. He talks about policing numbers, and I agree we should have more police on our streets, and we've got record numbers today. I've got to say he can't simply walk away from some of the choices his party made and my party made post-2010. Police numbers were cut back, and looking back now, that was the wrong thing to do. But that's not something he can walk away from, because those numbers dipped and they grew again under subsequent Conservative governments that now stand at a 50-year record. And I think probably a record ever in anybody's lifetime. Can I pick up this point, which I think is the basis of the honourable gentleman's speeches and securing this debate today, which is on the three strikes policy. And I say, he thinks three strikes. The honourable member for Boston and Skegness says 2 strikes. The honourable member for Mansfield, which I thought was a fantastic speech and most unexpected, said it was 1 strike, and you're welcome to join this side of the House anytime he wants. Just on another point, the honourable member for Boston and Skegness, in terms of people, in terms of benefits being also a privilege, not a right, and people should have to search for a job, for example, and behave well to get those benefits. We introduced the claimant commitment to do exactly that. So we have taken action in this area as well, which is extremely controversial, of course, and we've had to stand up time and time again in debates to defend our sanctions policy, because we do not think it is right that people can simply leave the labour market and not try to find work. So, again, action taken there. The honourable gentleman, the member for Ashfield, takes the point, where would people live if they kicked out these houses, which is a controversial point, of course. And that took me back to actually my mum. So my mum was a social worker who rehabilitated offenders, people coming out of jail and trying to find them a job and trying to find them a house. And eventually she convinced landladies to put these people up who were trying to get back, trying to get that second chance that I think most of us would like to make sure people have. And then she built a purpose-built hostel for those people. But she had a very clear rule. There was no drink and no drugs while you were in that hostel or in those landladies' bedrooms. And all the probation service was saying, you can't do this because these people have very difficult lives. And I think the Honourable Member for Mid-Cheshire pointed that out, and I agree with his point, that these people have very complex lives. But nevertheless, she always stuck to the line that if you didn't abide by that rule, you could not be in that landlady's guest house or in that hostel. It was one strike and you're out. It was simple as that. Everybody knew the rule. Everybody knew the rule. It was tough love, but it worked. And she got many people back on the straight and narrow because she was very straight down the line about it. And I'm sure there were no more resources then than there are today. And resources will always be tight. So I do think we've got to show that tough love to people in these situations to say what the rules will be. So, again, Chair, thank you for the chance to speak in this debate today. I'm very keen to hear what the Minister says, what he's going to do about this. I say he's a very decent man. I do not believe he's going to show the tough love that we need in this particular situation. I fear he'll be, not him personally, but his government will be too weak. And I think he'll look back in 2030 when possibly his ministerial career has ended, a new government takes his place, or a new minister takes his place, and I think he'll look back in anger that he did not do more.
I'll call the Minister, but can I gently remind him that 2 minutes or a couple of minutes wind up for the member for Ashfield.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and Christmas may be over, but I've been visited by the ghost of Christmas future in 2030 and what my life might look like. I have to say, I'd be amazed if I would still be a minister in 2030. Wouldn't that be a privilege to have had a long career serving my country? I would love that. And I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Ashfield for securing this debate. And my favourite debates in this chamber, I'm in this chamber a lot, as I know a lot of colleagues in the chamber today are. And my favourite ones are the ones not where individuals often bring very interesting cases around things that they're really interested in. And I've done that myself, raised things that I personally have a strong and long enduring interest in. But the better ones are the ones that are really rooted in the lives of our constituents. And, this is one, and we can tell from colleagues of all different political persuasions, from all different parts of the UK, all with the same challenge. And we all deal with this in our mailbag. And more importantly, people in our communities all deal with this every day. Of doing the decent thing, of going to work, working hard, of bringing your kids up, of not really wanting much else other than just be able to get on with a quiet life, and then having to go home to disturbance, to noise, to aggression, to smell, whatever it is, and having to live their life that way. And that is, that is so unfair, so unjust, and it is right that both the government of the day and the Parliament of the day believe that that's important and that we have a role in changing that. And we know that antisocial behaviour is not merely a nuisance. It has devastating personal consequences. It corrodes people's freedom, makes them not want to leave the house, damages their mental health, ultimately undermines their sense of home. And that's why tackling antisocial behaviour is an important priority for this government through our Safer Streets mission. And we will put, and this is our on-record commitment, we will put thousands of neighbourhood police and police community support officers into local communities so that residents have a named officer to turn to when things go wrong. We will look at the powers, and colleagues have talked about powers that exist, but we think they need to be augmented as well through respect orders, so there are tough sanctions, proper penalties, and crucially, I think there's a significant gap at the moment, those who make persistent offences, that those penalties grow and are serious ones. Now, the honourable member, the member for Ashfield, in his opening, I agreed with what he said about social housing being a gem. It's, in many ways, I think, the bedrock of my community. Good, decent homes where people can grow up, where people can go to work, where people can thrive and live their lives. So it makes it doubly painful when those small number of individuals choose, therefore, to have this gem, this thing that very many others on the waiting list would be desperate to secure, and instead perpetrate antisocial behaviour, make their neighbours' lives a misery. It's a double insult. And I think from what he said, and I'm going to address the three strikes point a little bit later, but I will give a clear response on that point. But also from what he talked about, the important relationship between central government, local government, the providers themselves, the police. This is an all-sector approach to try and tackle these individuals and to assemble the right powers, whether that's through tenancies, whether that's through the effectiveness of the courts, whether that's providers themselves doing their jobs. And those are points I'm going to cover in my contribution. And any debate that starts with Clement Attlee is always a good debate. And I think if you look around the country, you can see the impact of his Labour government and subsequent Labour governments, whether it's social housing, whether it's our National Health Service, whether it's the minimum wage. We build those basic standards that make people's lives better and help them thrive, and this government will be in that spirit, and I look forward to his support. I look forward to the honourable member from Boston and Skegness, his support as well in doing it. Of course I'll give way.
Lee Anderson.
It's a good point the Minister makes, and he speaks very passionately about Clement Attlee. What do you think, I want to know, Chair, what the Minister would think of, what would Clement Attlee think today of the state of our welfare state system and social housing?
Minister.
Well, Clement Attlee, I mean, we're in danger of because I could do this all day on Clement Attlee, but Clement Attlee's policies and politics were rooted in organising in the East End. And he went to the East End of London. We forget this, and often, certainly, the honourable gentleman is no stranger to internal Labour Party dynamics, but Clement Attlee was a man of exceptional privilege. But he chose to go into the places where life was hardest, and he looked at the living conditions of individuals in the East End of London and non-judgmentally sought to change them. And that he understood that some people had substance abuse issues. They manifested perhaps a little bit differently to today, but it's the same principle. Others had mental health issues, others had physical health issues, there was domestic abuse, those things that, we're talking about the 1930s, but actually not so different nearly 100 years on, and sought to change them. What he never did was sought to divide people into worthy and unworthy people, that he would never write people off. And again, that's, there is an important conversation in this about where, this is at the nub of this debate, when is too much too much? Where is that line? At what point what is tough love? What is an effective way of change? I will address later. The honourable gentleman talked about not caring where those who are evicted go. I actually do care, and I'll address that point in a little while. And that is the balance. And I think that's perhaps I'll happily give way on that point.
Kevin Hollenrick.
Just on that point in terms of people being unworthy, can I make the point that my mum would have made? It wasn't the person who was unworthy themselves as an individual. It was just that they were unworthy of living in a social house or in terms of her hostel and those kind of things. You've got to have that kind of tough love to create that incentive for people to behave properly.
Minister.
I totally accept that point. The challenge will be, the honourable gentleman will know from his leadership in his business career and his senior status within the previous government, every individual reacts differently to different circumstances. I like many colleagues, sport, and I'm the kind of person, you don't need to shout at me about the mistakes I've made. I know the mistakes and I carry them and I think about them all the time. I need an arm around my shoulder. There's other people who need shouting at. It's about finding that model, about what it is to make that change. If change is the thing, which I think for most of it is, but what you can't lose alongside that is, people like me who advocate and perhaps take a longer lens for change than colleagues opposite, that in that moment, those people living next door are living in misery. So that's why you have to have that line, and I'm going to talk about where that might fall. My honourable friend from Mansfield, and I will say to the Shadow Secretary of State, it should not surprise him the quality of his contribution. If he hears the honourable gentleman speak on a number of issues, he will see that the quality is there. And I have to say, my honourable friend, the member for Mansfield, the honourable gentleman, the member for Ashfield, I had to check, was this 2024 or was this 2014? Had we got the old band back together? But there's a lot of Nottingham and Nottinghamshire within this, because we've all known each other for a very, very long time and would share the view. And I think I would associate myself with the comments that the honourable gentleman made about Nottinghamshire Police. And how important it is that we have good policing and that we give them the tools and the resources to do that well in our community. But the thing I took from his contribution is just how frustrating the process is. And again, I took this from the honourable member for Ashfield's contribution as well, that having sat for years, 13 years in my case across local authority and this place, just sitting there yet again saying, well, have you done any diary sheets? And all that constant burden of proof being on those who are doing the decent thing. And it's the seemingly ever higher mountain to climb to get some degree of justice. And again, that's something I'm going to return to shortly. I'm really pleased, as I always am, to hear the contribution from the honourable gentleman from Strangford, because if nothing else, it shows that Northern Ireland, as he say, reserve matter with regards to policing, but that the issues are similar. They're not similar. And I would always say that people in Bulwell in my community and people in Newton Ards and his, I suspect, aren't that different. And I suspect similarly they want that decent treatment. And that the vast majority of them, and I know this for sure for both his and my community, the vast majority are decent people who do the right thing. And that's why it's all the more frustrating when individuals don't. But I took particularly the point that he made about reputation, because sometimes people talk down my community. And that angers me, because my community is chock full of brilliant people who, whether it's being just by being great parents, whether it's by being great friends, whether it's by contributing and volunteering, every day make the world a better place. And that's why, again, it's angry when that small number of people who can cause a big amount of disruption choose to do so. And he mentioned legislation, and again, some colleagues have said perhaps we do need legislation, others have said we haven't, and I'm going to set the case out as to why I think we do. But I would say to colleagues, the Renters' Rights Bill is back next Tuesday, it's at its report stage, this is a very good moment, we would be within an amendment window. So if there are those ideas, bring them forwards. And we've got the other, we've got the stages in the other place as well. This is something I think clearly there is broad interest in. I think something where we could have a lot of very good contribution. My honourable friend, the member for Mid Cheshire, I think how he sets out that rebirth of social housing is absolutely at the core of what this government intends to do, because we think that having that social house, it can be a real foundation on which people build their lives, which makes it all the more important that we have those appropriate checks and balances for those who don't deal with them, who don't behave properly within them. But also his point around policing I'll address shortly, because without that, it doesn't matter what laws or rules you have, you simply won't be able to enforce them. And then the honourable member, the honourable gentleman, the member for Boston and Skegness, talked about broken windows theory, which again I think something I share in terms of its interest, in its importance. I mean, where I might challenge it slightly is that I don't think it's as simple as saying we don't want any broken windows around here. It's saying that when we have broken windows, we fix them. Because of one broken window, the second broken window is more likely to be broken than the first, because people think, hey, you break windows around here. So it's about having that resourcing to do that. We talked also about visible police presence, which is something that's very important to this new government. There is a trade-off. The honourable gentleman says these things need to be paid for. And that's the challenge of the government of the day. It will be the challenge for opposition parties about balancing that. I'll happily give it.
James McMurdoch.
On that point, I very much appreciate you giving way there. The numbers, as I understand them in my local area, is that Essex Police have the highest number of police officers in history. But if I speak to the residents on the street, I very often get the exact same response, that they never see their police officers, or they don't recognise those numbers as fact. So would the honourable, or the right honourable member agree with me that perhaps how we're using our resources very much should be looked at?
Yeah.
Minister?
I totally agree with that, and I have this conversation with my constituents. I was the Shadow Police Minister before the election, and I saw the Police Minister, the Home Secretary of the time, both of whom I hold in high regard, kind of tear their hair out over this question. How are we at the point where the honourable gentleman said, oh, well, we've employed more police officers than ever before. We cut them, and then we've added them back. Why aren't people happier? The reality is that the funding mechanism used to do that squeezed out civilian staff, so that we now have 10,000 fewer police officers in frontline roles. There have never been more police officers, 6,000 in this case, sat behind desks, doing things that their skills are not, that they weren't trained for, and their skills are wasted doing. We have to change that, and that's part of our neighbourhood policing guarantee to get those 13,000 more police and police community support officers. Happily good way.
Kevin Hollenright.
Just taking back to the broken window point, the broken window policing was not just about fixing the windows. He's right to say that was part of it, because that created the opportunity for more crime, because people didn't care. It was also about arresting people for low-level crimes, very low-level crimes and antisocial behaviour, which is also very effective and a very important part of that policy.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. And I think of Red Hook to continue the New York example, I think, of HoC and their courts, that the idea was they weren't just going to nick people for low-level crimes, they were going to see them through court very quickly and, make sure there were sanctions there as a proper deterrent. I think, sadly, we're a very, very long way away from that. One of my biggest challenges with constituents is that they fear there's no point in staying in the game with regards to the court system because they're getting hearing dates already for 2026, and that's a real challenge that's at the root of justice in this country. So just to make a few points of my own in covering what colleagues have said, it does start with social housing providers, in the sense that we would always want any issues to be nipped in the bud. So if someone's done something they really shouldn't have done, a loud party, perhaps they're leaving their bicycle in the way, that interaction should be a quite easy one, should be a resolution and should be no reoccurrence, and that reduces antisocial behaviour. That should be very good. So we want to see them do that, and they ought to do that. Similarly, though, it is right that when preventative measures fail, landlords can move decisively and quickly to tackle tenants who persistently abuse their tenancies. And there are a range of powers already on the statute book, including eviction, but again, as we know from colleagues, that process doesn't feel like it always works. So we've had those conversations with social landlords. We of course would re-emphasise that they can apply to a court to remove tenants that carry out antisocial behaviour, but the process can be very difficult, and I'm going to talk in a second about how that might be made better. But it starts at allocation as well, and there's a little bit of conversation about who gets access to social housing. Local authorities can and do, including my own, deprioritise tenants who have a history of bad behaviour. The majority, we believe it's about 75%, of local authorities undertake antisocial behaviour or other criminal behaviour type tests ahead of allocating a social home. I suspect colleagues may be interested in checking with their local authority as to whether they're in the 3 quarters or the quarter, because that's the front door to making sure that perhaps those who have behaved badly in the past don't get access and the opportunity to do it again. But when it comes to evictions itself, there are powers there at the moment. So Housing Act 1985, Housing Act 1988, but it is difficult. So our plan, and the Honourable Gentleman from Boston Skegness suggests perhaps not more legislation, but our plan is for more legislation in this space. So that's through the Renters' Rights Bill. We'll enable housing association landlords to make a claim to a court for repossession immediately in the most serious cases, rather than having to provide a notice period and all the harm that can happen in those cases, but also to amend the matters that judges must consider on deciding whether to award possession under the discretionary ground. And this, I think, is very important, to give judges particular regard to whether tenants have engaged with efforts to resolve their behaviour and the impact on other tenants. Because often, as we know from our casework, they just simply don't answer letters, won't let the housing patch manager in. Well, that will be a factor in the future. I think that's very welcome. But I do want to address the 3 strikes point, but firstly the not interested point about where people go. Well, I am interested in that, not least because, as the crow flies, Kirkby to Bulwell, 8-9 miles? So if they, one way or the other, either people being booted out of houses in my constituency end up in your community, and vice versa. So that's why I think we should take an interest, that actually, if we can help people resolve mental health issues, we should do that. If we can help people address substance abuse issues, we should do that. And what we can't pretend is that by evicting them from their housing, they suddenly will not be a problem elsewhere. I don't think that's the case, and that's why we must take an interest in and want to reduce reoffending, reduce and improve and promote rehabilitation. And on the point of 3 strikes, I think my particular issue with it is the rigidity, because there are cases, I would be very clear with my local authority that if someone set their neighbour's car on fire or attacked them or was the organiser and the perpetrator of a drugs network from their social house, well, that 1 strike should be plenty. But I would also say, I'll give way in a second, but because I would also say that in a case where perhaps a lone parent's doing all the best they can do, and they have a child that is clearly struggling and doing bad behaviours, whether it's the sort of behaviours that others have mentioned, that actually I would be trying to solve that problem before thinking that shifting them out of that house would actually help rather than hinder. So the 3 strikes, I don't think is flexible enough. And I also do fear that it is at risk of being weaponised, because we will also have situations where you see both neighbours in your constituency surgery, and if there is a hard and fast rule and you've only got to get 3 complaints found against your neighbour and they're out, well, that might promote that type of activity. Sorry, I give way.
Lee Anderson.
This time, you talked about a situation where somebody might torch somebody's car, and that's a serious enough offence to lose their tenancy. This has actually happened in Ashfield, all over my constituency. We even had a case where we had a house fire by a nuisance tenant and still wasn't evicted. So it doesn't work.
Minister.
No, and I think, as I say, that's why we're making the changes within the Renters' Rights Bill that we are. And I wouldn't have disagreed with that. In those cases, their neighbours must tear their hair out and wonder what has to happen in order for the right thing to happen. I just want to, I'm conscious of time remaining, but I did want to mention our approach to antisocial behaviour and policing more generally, because we have to have neighbourhood police back on the street. We've lost neighbourhood policing in this country. The Honourable Gentleman, the Shadow Secretary of State, talks about the importance of low-level crime. Well, we've essentially decriminalised retail crime in this country, so we've seen an explosion of it, all that misery. And until and unless we have the proper policing resource to get into that space, which is why we've made, and the Prime Minister announced on 5th of December through our Plan for Change, our zero-tolerance approach to antisocial behaviour, and critically, our 13,000 more police and police community support officers out there, named contacts, working on antisocial behaviour action plans with local communities, and then using new tools like respect orders to make sure that the individuals who are doing the wrong thing are being tackled in their behaviour. Because there is a straight line across, because I will say this from 13 years of talking to people about problems with their neighbours. The first question I ask, and you really cross your fingers behind your back, is your neighbour a private tenant or a social housing tenant? Because actually it's much easier with a social housing tenant because there tends to be behaviour contracts. There is a legislative framework. If I have to chase a private landlord who might not, I mean, I can't believe anyone wouldn't live in Nottingham, but if they didn't live, might not live in Nottingham, might live in Derby, for example, or indeed might not live in Britain, that becomes really hard too. So we need broader tools that go beyond, ones in which we might work with social housing providers. And that's what will be coming forward in our crime and policing bill in this session. So to conclude, I'd like to thank the Honourable Gentleman for prompting this important debate and for all Honourable Members for their contributions. We're very alive to this issue. That's why we're acting in the Renters' Rights Bill. That's why we've got the Policing and Crime Bill to come. We are interested in hearing people's ideas and we'll always engage with them properly. We've got a sense for today the direction we're going, and I look forward to working with colleagues in the future. Thank you.
Lee Anderson to wind up.
Thank you, Chair. So I thank everybody for turning up for this debate today. And what have we learnt in this chamber today? We've learned that the Honourable Member for Mansfield should be the housing spokesman for Reform UK. I think that's probably the main thing. And there's plenty of seats over here.
Maybe you're coming home.
What I have learnt, actually, is that I've been far too soft on this issue. And I'm astounded because I first debated this in 2015 as a councillor in Ashfield District Council and said pretty much the same as what I said today. And I got booed out the chamber by the Labour group. It's incredible. They disagreed with everything I said, but how things have changed over the past 10 years or so, because I'm disappointed with the attendance actually today. Because this is a problem that touches every single constituency in the United Kingdom. Everyone, every constituency has a council estate. Every constituency has these problems, and every single MP in this House has casework, a lot of casework on this issue. And I've got the greatest respect for the Shadow Minister, he knows that. But I look at the benches behind here, and there's not one turned up to contribute. I look at the government benches, yeah, there's two turned up, and they made reasonable contributions.
Generous.
A better turnout on this side of the House, must I say. But, the point of this place is to change things. It's to make people's lives better. It's to make people's lives easier. It's to make people's lives safer. And if we can't do that in this Parliament, then what is the point of us being here? So I will hold my hands up and apologise for the three strikes policy. I want to go far too liberal. I'd rather go with the dog whistle politics of the member for Mansfield. One striking it out, and I'll just say this to the Minister before I finish. It's a deterrent. And when I said I don't care where they live, what I'm saying is, if you have a deterrent where people know they're going to lose their tenancy, lose their home, lose a place to sleep, they will stop this straight away. So hopefully, moving forward, this government will act on this and make the lives of people in Ashfield and all around the country on these council estates much better. Thank you very much, Chair.
The question is that this House has considered social housing tenants and antisocial behaviour. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.